As Lou mentioned, my name is Doug Dowell, and I was born and raised in Bishop Hill. I heard about Forrest Cady as a very young boy, and it was always very intriguing to me. And so in my adult life, I've been able to do a little bit more research about Forrest Cady. And I imagine many of you remember the Bishop Hill Swedes fast pitch softball team. As a kid growing up, I caught the tail end of fast pitch softball before it gave way to the slow pitch softball. But fast pitch softball in Bishop Hill roughly took place from 1930 to 1970. But prior to fast pitch softball, the sport of choice in Bishop Hill was baseball. And there's actually a brief article in an 1888 Bishop Hill newspaper. Yes, Bishop Hill had a newspaper, I believe, for all of 2 years. But in 1888, the village allocated funds for the youth and young men to partake in baseball. They allocated the funds for baseballs, baseball bats, and other related equipment. And so it's very interesting to me that Forrest Cady, who was born in 1886, grew up with such support surrounding baseball and the encouragement to engage in it. As you can tell from this first slide, Forrest Cady played for the Boston Red Sox. He played between the years of 1912 and 1917, and he finished his professional major league career in 1919. But today, I'm going to step back to 1886 and give you a little bit of history, not only of Forrest Cady's personal life and his relationship to Bishop Hill, but also I'm going to share with you his professional baseball career that lasted until he passed away in 1946 at the age of 60. So I hope you enjoy the presentation today, and it reminds you a little bit of the history of Bishop Hill, and then kind of the neat aspect of Major League Baseball and our connection with it from this small town. In this second slide, these are Forrest's parents, Minnie Hollander and Jonas Berglund. Minnie Hollander was actually born in the colony in Bishop Hill, and her parents would have been part of that second wave of immigrants to come over, right? The first wave came over in 1846 and settled Bishop Hill. Jonas Berglund was actually from Sweden in that second wave of immigrants, born in Sweden. Minnie was actually born in Bishop Hill. Jonas came over in the second wave of immigrants. They were married in 1883. The marriage only lasted 7 years. They divorced in 1890, but it produced 3 children. The oldest, Victor, then Forrest, and then their youngest sister, Bessie. So in 1890, Minnie is a single mother with 3 children. By 1892, she's married Frank Cady, who is a local carpenter here in town. And Frank was a widower and had 2 children of his own. So when they combined the families, they now had 5 children. Minnie and Frank went on to have 3 more children as well for a family of 8, which probably wasn't very uncommon, but most of us today would think that's crazy talk, right? So Forrest was part of a larger family, but it was also a blended family as well. Forrest's father, Jonas, left Bishop Hill in 1898 and went back to Sweden, never to return. So he never saw Forrest play baseball. He never saw Forrest rise up through what we would call the minor league system today and into professional baseball and play in front of 30,000 people and be a World Series champion. He died in Sweden in the 1930s. Jonas Berglund did. So to answer your question of why is he Cady and not a Berglund, his mother remarried, and Forrest was very young at the time, and he chose to take the Cady surname. And I imagine it was just easier. He was never officially adopted. Matter of fact, later on when his brother Victor died, who was a few years older than Forrest, his obituary listed him as Victor Berglund. And so he didn't seem like he took on the Cady name, not as strongly as Forrest did. But Forrest was always known as Cady, even though it wasn't legally his name. So if anybody ever makes it out to the Baseball Hall of Fame, or you want to Google Forrest Cady, you have to do Forrest Cady. Berglund won't show up anywhere. So. This is a couple of photos in the next few slides that I have to give courtesy and credit to Bob Hampton. When I started this process about 30 years ago of studying Forrest Cady, it was pre-internet, it was pre-email, and I was writing letters to the National Baseball Hall of Fame and waiting weeks for their return. And when I got the letter back from the Baseball Hall of Fame, they sent me what was in the file for Forrest Cady. You've probably never heard of Forrest Cady, so you can imagine the file was pretty slim, right? It wasn't like I asked for Babe Ruth's file. But in that file were a few names and addresses, and I reached out by letter and included my phone number to the folks that were considered to be nephews and nieces and great-nephews and great-nieces to Forrest Cady. Bob Hampton was a great-nephew of Forrest Cady and was kind enough to call me back, and this is in the late 1990s. And so he was also kind enough to send me photos from their collection. He wanted me to keep them as I was explaining my work, so I'm very appreciative of Mr. Hampton. And this is Cady and his sister, Bessie. And again, roughly 1889, I'm guessing that Cady was about 3 years old and his sister was 1 year old. And they didn't have much for child security back then. She's propped up on a stand there. And I've looked at so many photos of Cady, I can see it in his eyes, this young child's picture. In the next photo, this is, I guess I've referred to it as a teenage photo of Cady. I'm not exactly sure how old he is, and Bob Hampton wasn't certain about it either. But this is his sister Bessie standing, Forrest sitting, and the little girl was not identified. My guess is, though, it's the daughter of the marriage between Minnie and Frank Cady, which would be Blanche. But I'm not 100% certain of that, but I'm not sure who else it would be. So there's a little bit of background about Forrest and his upbringing in Bishop Hill, being introduced to baseball, supported by the community, a few photos. Not much was known of him other than his stepfather was a carpenter in the community. They didn't have much write-ups about baseball for younger individuals. Most of the baseball was organized baseball at that time, played by at least adult men, 17 and over. But it certainly, I'm sure Forrest was watching those games, taking part in some way of playing ball, although there's really no indication of that. This is a photo of Forrest in a baseball uniform. Again, I'm guessing he's about 20 years old now. I can't link this uniform up to any of his minor league years that he played, so I'm assuming it's probably associated with a local team, whether that's the Bishop Hill or he played for Kewanee club as well. So I'm thinking this is about his age 20 season. In 1903, so Forrest is 17 years of age, he played organized baseball for the first time. Bishop Hill had a team that played in the Henry County League. And that's how serious baseball was taken. All the small towns around here had ball teams. They would also often call them their team of nine, the lingo from back in the day. And I found articles of Bishop Hill playing Osco. I'm not even sure Osco is even in existence anymore, but they would, each one of these small towns took it relatively seriously. And so from 1903, 04, 05, and 06, Cady played for the Bishop Hill team, an amateur team. And during those years, Ben Arnquist was the coach / manager of the team. And he gets a lot of credit in the literature, and Cady even mentions him later on, that he taught him the finer points of outfield work and hitting. Although Cady never played the outfield in the major leagues, he only played catcher. So I'm not sure if that's a backhanded compliment to Mr. Arnquist or not, but Ben Arnquist, if you're local, you might recognize the last name, was very influential with Cady. And in this next photo, this is your pennant-winning Bishop Hill Swedes in 1906. They won the Henry County Championship, and Mr. Cady is right here, and the gentleman in the bolo hat is Mr. Arnquist. who was the coach manager of the team. I love this photo. It's on the front steps of the Colony School, if I'm not mistaken. It emanates Bishop Hill to me. And they do have a couple ball bats and a mask and a mitt there. I'm going to show you some of this equipment that Cady would have used coming up.
The season for this team,
yep.
What were their seasons?
So it was roughly spring to October. They basically played a baseball season, probably more like September. Yeah. I never read about ball games being canceled because crops had to be planted or crops had to be harvested. My guess is most of these games took place on Sundays as well. And just in my reading, I know that was the case in many occasions. So, yeah. Cady was a very prominent player on this team. If you're a baseball fanatic, you'll know that batting over 300 is a really good batting average. Cady batted .361. They kept pretty detailed statistics, even though it was an amateur team. And at the same time Cady is playing for the Bishop Hill team, his older brother Victor, right, Victor Berglund, he didn't accept the Cady surname, is playing on a semi-pro team in Kewanee called the Kewanee Clippers. Okay, it's not affiliated with a minor league system. It's just a semi-pro team that plays other local communities. And Ike Reno was the manager of that team, and Cady would go to practices with his brother. And by 1906, he was begging Ike Reno for a place on the team and a tryout. And Ike Reno reluctantly allowed him to be on the team as a backup outfielder and a backup first baseman. So Cady is starting to dabble outside of Bishop Hill with baseball, but it's also for money, right? Semi-pro, and it's also against better competition. And as you can imagine, his brother being older than him, he's facing older men as well. His big break came in 1906. He was actually doing double duty between the Bishop Hill Ball Club and the Kewanee Clippers. And at a doubleheader in Bradford, Illinois, the starting catcher by the last name of Carlson split his finger. They didn't have another catcher on the team. Cady volunteered to step in and catch that day. He had never caught before, and that was the start of Cady being a catcher. And he basically never relinquished that position, and it's what took him to the major leagues eventually as well. So his big break came on an injury, and then in 1908 he started. And so that ended the 1906 season. In 1907, Cady had the bug of playing professionally, and he actually went to Rock Island, Illinois, to try out for their team, which was in what's called the 3I League. And the I stood for Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. It was a very prominent minor league baseball system. Many major league players came from the 3I League. If you're a baseball fan today, it would be considered AA baseball in the minor league system. So kind of two steps below Major League Baseball. But Cady didn't make the team. He was turned away. And so he came back home to Bishop Hill, and he played for the Bishop Hill amateur team again, and then eventually got hooked on at Monmouth, Illinois, which was another semi-pro team. They would have been playing those Kewanee Clippers. Cady got so much better at catching that he either caught the attention of a scout or the coach in Monmouth had a connection, because at the end of the 1907 season, Cady was sold for $300 to Indianapolis of a higher minor league division. So Cady made his way to Indianapolis, probably thought he had made it, and he was there for the last 2 or 3 weeks of the season and never played. So it came kind of to a crushing blow for him. I think many of us would think, oh, I'm not good enough to make it, but I think what it did for Cady was gave him further hope. I am getting better. I am able to make these leaps and bounds. And so in 1908, he started with the Kewanee Boilermakers. Remember, the previous team was the Clippers. They were a semi-pro team. The Kewanee Boilermakers were part, and I want to make sure I get this right, of the Central Association. This would be a very low-level minor league baseball franchise. The minor leagues back in the day, back in the 1900s, were much different than they are today. So, but it would be equivalent to like a single-A ball team. And so he started with the Kewanee Boilermakers halfway through the season, and I can't figure out why he transferred to the Ottumwa Packers of the same association. So Kewanee may have traded him to Ottumwa. Maybe I don't know how it would have worked, but somehow he ends up in Ottumwa and finishes the season with the Ottumwa Packers. So again, Cady's kind of making the rounds. He's making a name for himself. He's playing catcher. And by the end of 1908, he had played well enough that Evansville, I love the team names, the Evansville River Rats, were excited to purchase him. And so he was bought by the Evansville River Rats and would be scheduled to play with them the following year. But while Cady was finishing out the 1908 season in Ottumwa, Iowa, he came back with more than the thrill of baseball. As you'll see in this next slide, he also came back with a wife. Cady waited till after the season, but he met Katie Monnier, often referred to as Kitty. They married in December of 08, and they moved back to this area outside of the baseball season. So Forrest and Kitty married in 1908 and remained married until his death in 1946. And this is one of the few photos I've seen from this time period where people actually smile. So it's kind of interesting to see that. But that is Kitty and Cady. So again, thanks to Bob Hampton for this. In this next slide, you'll see his minor league stops. And so I've taken you so far up to Evansville. Remember, he played in Kewanee. He played in Ottumwa. He was just sold to Evansville. And he played 2 years at Evansville, where he gained a great reputation as a defensive catcher. If you're not familiar with what that means, it basically means he was very good at catching the ball, throwing out runners, blocking pitches that were in the dirt by the pitcher. He had a very good grasp of how to call a game, meaning what pitches to call. And he also found a little pop in his bat, meaning he was hitting doubles, triples, and the occasional home run while at Evansville. And that made him very attractive to teams higher up the ladder. And so while he was in Evansville, 1910, Newark Indians of Newark, New Jersey purchased his contract, and they were part of the Eastern League. This would be the highest level of minor league baseball at the time. The Eastern League was where all the professional baseball players came from. If you had made it to the Eastern League, it was just probably a matter of time to find out if you were good enough to go to the major leagues. And in 1911, he again set personal highs at Newark. He was just developing as a young baseball player. So much so that in November of that year, the Boston Red Sox paid $6,000 to the Newark Indians and traded them 2 players for Cady's services. So Cady, at the beginning of 1912, was now a Boston Red Sox. And what a year it was for Mr. Cady. He's 26 years of age. He's 6'2", by those standards is very tall. He weighed 179 pounds. He also was very prominent in the baseball circles now, at least as a minor leaguer. He hadn't proven himself at the highest level, but he's probably feeling pretty good about himself. For those of you who maybe have been to Boston, you know how important Fenway Park is to the Boston community. Fenway Park was built in 1912. Forrest Cady is the first players to step into Fenway Park in its existence. And I'm a baseball nut. That just amazes me to this day. And so I want to make sure I get my date correct. On April 20th was opening day against the New York Highlanders. They just hadn't changed their name to the Yankees yet. They were known as the Highlanders in 1912. The Boston Red Sox beat them in extra innings 7-6, and Cady is sitting there in front of 27,000 people. Right? Little kid from Bishop Hill, Illinois, who doesn't make it in Rock Island, who plays for the amateur league, who plays in Kewanee a little while, makes his name in Evansville, Indianapolis, finally Newark, is sitting in what we would consider the cathedral of baseball stadiums today. Right? Fenway Park, brand spanking new. Not only was he on the opening day roster, 6 days later he got his first action as a catcher. He was a starting catcher 6 days later. And again, if you're a baseball fanatic, you'll know the name Connie Mack. He owned and coached the Philadelphia Athletics for over 50 years. He's a Hall of Fame coach and manager, owner. That was the team that Cady was playing against that day in 1912. So as you will notice here, these are the champions. They won the World Series that year. They beat the New York Giants, which is, again, the precursor to the San Francisco Giants. They beat them 4-3, right? I think everybody probably knows the World Series is a best-of-7 series, but they had to play 8 games that year. One game ended in a tie because of darkness, right? You don't even think about that because, oh yeah, they didn't have lights. And so one game got called for darkness. So the series finale was actually 4-3 with one tie. Earlier in that year, Forrest Cady had a situation happen on June 29th. He actually made it into Ripleys Believe It or Not. I think everybody here probably remembers the Ripleys. Fascinating things that couldn't possibly happen get recorded by Ripleys Believe It or Not. It's just neat for me to know that Forrest Cady was included in this. There's a logical explanation for why. At that date, on June 29th, he was up to bat with his teammate on third base. The pitcher threw the ball. Cady swung and hit a single to the outfield and ran to first base, and the gentleman from third base ran home to score the run. Prior to Cady hitting the ball, though, the umpire threw his arms up and yelled, "balk," which means that the pitcher did not come completely set before he threw the ball, which is a deception to the runner. And the penalty is the runners all get to advance one base. So the runner from third got to come home. Cady had to rebat. So Cady got up again. The next pitch, he hit a double. And Ripley's Believe It or Not said, Forrest Cady's the only man ever known to get 2 hits in one at bat. Yeah. So kind of a fun thing to research and to find out that Cady's in, holy cow, what did this guy do? And I'm reading this, and they obviously didn't understand the rules. But yeah, it is kind of a neat thing. Here you are again, 26 years old, Bishop Hill, Illinois, rookie year, brand new park, World Series champions. I'm in Ripley's Believe It or Not. And when they won the World Series, he got $4,024 for his winner's share. They split the receipts with the owners back then. So Cady's living the good life at this point. In that World Series, he played in 7 of the 8 games, and he collected 3 hits. So he just wasn't riding the bench. He was the main catcher in the 1912 World Series. In this particular slide, this is from 1913 and 1914. I took pictures from different time periods just because they represented the gentleman well. But this is Forrest Cady on the left and Smokey Joe Wood on the right. Smokey Joe Wood was a pitcher extraordinaire in 1912. Cady's rookie year, Smokey Joe Wood had been around for a while. He had the name Smokey Joe Wood because he threw so hard that the batter only saw smoke going by. And the pitchers of the time that were well known, like Walter Johnson, who was an incredible Hall of Fame pitcher, actually proclaimed that nobody threw as hard as Smokey Joe Wood. So he was a very prominent pitcher. In 1912, when they won the World Series, Smokey Joe Wood won 34 games and lost 5. He was unbelievably good pitcher, but he also threw a lot of innings, which probably ended his career shortly because back then they called it a dead arm, but he probably tore something in his shoulder at that time. But he was a phenomenal pitcher that the Red Sox did everything they could to keep. And in 1912, he developed such a rapport with Forrest Cady in spring training, where they trained in Hot Springs, Arkansas, that he insisted to the coach that Forrest Cady be his personal catcher. So you have the best pitcher in baseball requesting this 26-year-old rookie to be their personal catcher for the season. And so that helped keep Cady on that ball team as well. So kind of a neat little background. Actually, the Bishop Hill Heritage Association has in their archives, and I have a personal copy myself, Smokey Joe Wood lived until the late 1980s. He was 95 years old. In his late 80s or early 90s, his son interviewed him about his playing days. And he went to great lengths about Forrest Cady and what a great catcher he was. And that's why he wanted him to be a personal catcher for him. He also said that he thought the management was going to cut Cady that year, but he liked him so much that he made it a demand for him. So again, kind of a neat little background story about Mr. Cady. 1912, again, was the World Series year. In 1913, the following year, Cady was the opening day catcher, meaning he was probably the best catcher on the team. They wanted him out there the first game. Unfortunately, the Red Sox did not make it back to the World Series. They finished in 4th place that year. In 1914, Cady's again on the Red Sox. They did not make it to the World Series, but they finished in 2nd place. And you have to remember there were only 16 teams back then. There was 8 in the American League and 8 in the National League. And the American League teams only played American League teams, and National League teams only played National League teams, and then they would meet in the World Series. Today, we have 30 or 30-plus Major League Baseball teams. They play across conferences, across divisions, so much different today than the traditional style. I love this photo. This is Mr. Cady in the middle. This is 1915, January of 1915. The Cady and the Red Sox offered Cady a new contract. They also offered Ernie Shore, this gentleman right here, a new contract. Ernie Shore was a phenomenal pitcher as well. He kind of took over after Smokey Joe Wood's arm went down. Ernie Shore threw a no-hitter. I believe Forrest Cady was the catcher for that no-hitter as well. But what I love about this photo is not only are they signing their contracts, if you notice the gentleman to the far left, they're signing their contracts along with this young rookie named Babe Ruth. So here's a photo of Forrest Cady and Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth had come up in July of 1914 and had pitched in a few games. He was only a pitcher then. And then in 1915, they agreed to re-sign him, and the Boston Red Sox signed all 3 the same date in January of 1915. So this is the 1915 Red Sox team. So Cady played in 1912 as a rookie, won the World Series. They got 4th place in 1913, 2nd place in 1914. In 1915, they win the World Series again. Kid from Bishop Hill's been in the major leagues 4 years, and he's won the World Series twice. Very, very amazing to me. He also had his best season in 1915. He played in 78 games. So about half of the games for the season. He had his highest batting average, and he was probably playing his best defense, according to all newspaper accounts as well. So he was at the peak of his game. By no means was he the best catcher in baseball, but he was certainly a very good catcher in the major leagues. There were others that had more notoriety. In particular, Mr. Schalk from the White Sox was probably the preeminent catcher at the time, but Forrest was right there. They had 3 catchers on the Boston Red Sox, and as you can imagine, the equipment back then probably had some banged up fingers every once in a while. No. So again, they beat the Philadelphia Phillies 4-1 in 1915, and Cady played in 4 of the games, collecting 2 hits in the World Series. And again, I really enjoy this photo. If you want to take a look at it later, I know it's difficult to read, but you have Cady right here in the middle. Right behind him is Babe Ruth again. I'm a baseball junkie, so this still just amazes me. The kid from Bishop Hill is playing with Babe Ruth. And then in this next slide, this happened on April 24th, 1915. So the World Series year. It's very early in the season. Right? I'm not sure what game number this is, but they're playing the Philadelphia Athletics, probably game 10, 12, 13, somewhere in there. It's very early in the season. And Forrest Cady is not playing in this game. He doesn't start the game. But the pitcher for the day is Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth, not known yet as a hitter, only a pitcher. And it got to a critical point in the game where they decided they needed a good batter up to the plate instead of that lousy Babe Ruth kid. They called on Forrest Cady. Forrest Cady is one of very few men to ever pinch hit for Babe Ruth. So, yeah, I would hang my hat on that alone. And so you can see, here, Hick was the pinch hitter for Babe Ruth, and he did not get a hit. At the end of the year, because pitchers had to hit back then, Babe Ruth accumulated a lot of games because he pitched every 4th or 5th day. He had a 50-point higher batting average than Cady. He hit 4 times as many home runs as Cady, and he had more RBIs than Cady, even though he played fewer games. So it was pretty obvious Babe Ruth was going to be a pretty good hitter. But thankfully, the coach didn't know it in April of 1915. Forrest Cady gets to be a trivial pursuit question. So as we move on to this next slide, Cady's just lapping it up here. He plays in the 1916 World Series, and they beat the Brooklyn Robins 4-1. The Brooklyn Robins, again, the names just hadn't changed over yet. They're today's Brooklyn Dodgers, or would eventually become Brooklyn Dodgers, moving to Los Angeles to be the Los Angeles Dodgers. Cady played in 2 of the games, getting 1 hit and 4 at-bats. He did a majority of the catching that year in 1916, but he struggled. Not only offensively, his defense started to wane as well. And today we would say he's on the downward slope of his career. There may have been other reasons for that. In talking with Bob Hampton, his nephew that loaned me the photos, he remembered his uncle as a heavy drinker as well, which would not have been uncommon early Major League Baseball. Self-medicating probably as well as a catcher. And there were rumors abound at Cady of drinking too much and getting into some issues as a Major League Baseball player. But nonetheless, his career started to go on the downside. And 1917 would be Cady's last game. But he won the World Series, so he's been in the Major Leagues 4 years. He's won 2 World Series. Life is good. And 1917 would be his last season with the Red Sox. They did not win the World Series, but he only appeared in 17 games and batted less than 200 for the season. Now, in October of 1917, he came home from playing with the Boston Red Sox, and this happened in October. On his way home, he's back in Bishop Hill, and on his way home from a night out in Kewanee with Mr. and Mrs. Milford Lundeberg, Cady came upon about 10 o'clock at night, came upon a horse and buggy on the road. And he didn't see it until it was too late. He swerved his car at the last moment, but he caught the back end of the buggy, took off the buggy wheel, and his car went rolling through the ditch 2 to 3 times. And Mr. Lundgren died immediately of a crushed skull. The 2 wives that were with them, Cady's wife and Lundgren's wife, both escaped with just bruises. Cady broke his left shoulder in multiple places. And so you would think his career is probably over at that time. But 3 months later, in January of 1918, Connie Mack of the Philadelphia Athletics traded for Cady. Doesn't make sense, right? Until you realize what Connie Mack's goal was. He was trying to cut all the high salary players on his team. And the best way to do that was to trade them. Sounds very similar to today, doesn't it? This guy's making too much money. We've got to get him out of here. And that's what took place. And Connie Mack said, no problem. I'll take Cady. I know I don't have to pay him anything. And so he took on a number of players to get rid of some of his higher priced players. But, it probably gave Cady hope. Here he is in 1918, and he's thinking, hey, I still have baseball left in me. I'm going to go to Philadelphia. I'm going to earn a place on the team. Cady, there's no indication in 1918 that Cady ever made the A's baseball team. I have found newspaper accounts that said Cady has helped warming up the pitchers. Today we would call it a bullpen catcher. Basically just sitting down in the bullpen, but he was never officially on the team, never played with them. And as a matter of fact, he had to leave them at the end of July because the Secretary of War, remember this is 1918, we're in the throes of World War I, Secretary of War said all able-bodied men must enter or enlist in the military or enter in work-related, what's the word I'm looking for, war work. And so Cady immediately went to Chester Shipbuilding Company in Chester, Pennsylvania, and became a shipbuilder. So from July until the end of World War I in 1918, he was a shipbuilder. But shortly after entering the shipbuilding business, about 5 days later, he was catching for the Chester Shipbuilding baseball team. So what I've figured out along the way is that many, because the Secretary of War was really pointing a finger at Major League Baseball saying, you guys got to lead the way. How can I expect everybody else to go to war or get jobs if I'm letting you guys skirt by? And so most of the Major League Baseball players that did not have deferments went to the shipyards. And in looking through those box scores, there are Hall of Fame players playing in this Delaware River conference that the different shipyards had created. So Cady played in there in 1918. And I believe this, here's his overall statistics for his career. We've talked a little bit about 1912 to 1917. 1918, he did not play, partially due to injury, but he was also working as a shipbuilder. And then in 1919, he actually caught on with the Philadelphia Phillies. He made a brief comeback. The Philadelphia Phillies were part of the National League, and so he was leaving the American League, what he was most familiar with. And by July of that year, he had played in 34 games. July of that year, he played in 34 games, which would have been about half of all the games. So he was a prominent fixture. Philadelphia was a terrible team that year, however. And on July 9th of 1919, Forrest Cady and 2 Philadelphia Phillies pitchers got into an argument with the umpire, and they were thrown out of the game. Rather than go back to their locker rooms, get cleaned up, and wait for their team to finish, or even leave the stadium, they decided to get dressed and go back into the bleachers and keep harassing the umpire and get the fans engaged. And the 2 pitchers were fined for this behavior and suspended for 10 days. Forrest Cady was fined and kicked out of baseball. He was kicked off of the team and basically blackballed from baseball. Nobody was going to sign Forrest Cady after that, after what he had done. He was kind of the instigator of all this. So the guy that goes into the Boston Red Sox, my Bishop Hill hero, doing all these wonderful things, pinch hitting for Babe Ruth, Ripleys Believe It or Not, 2 World Series, and he gets kicked out for harassing the umpire. He went out gloriously, I guess, if not infamously. So, and then you can see that he had a short term. But this is Hick, Cady, and Ernie Shore. And I provide this. Did we skip a slide by chance? No? Well, this particular slide shows you some of the equipment that Cady was wearing. This is Cady and Ernie Shore, and it might be difficult to see. It's not very big, but the catcher's equipment is just very large, very padded. You can't see the mask very well, but it's just wires across. It's not hard iron. It's not a durable plastic, obviously. And then the shin guards are very cumbersome as well. They go down all the way to the ground around their feet. So it was very cumbersome to be a catcher at that time. This next slide, this is the catcher's mitt that I think Cady would have been wearing. It's from 1910s, and it's hard. You never get a good picture of Cady's glove, and so I've tried to size it up as much as I possibly can. But the one thing I want to point out is that's the sweet spot of the glove, right? Catchers were using 2 hands. You hit the mitt and then catch it. And that is very dangerous. We don't promote that today. It's always keep your other hand out of the way so it don't get broken fingers. I'm sure this game took a toll on his body over the years. And the equipment, there's a reason they call catcher's gear the tools of ignorance. You have to be a little ignorant to get back there and do that particular position. So again, just to give you an idea of the catcher's mitt. In the next slide here, this is some of the baseball memorabilia. Forrest Cady actually has baseball cards out there. In 1912, because he was part of the World Series team, you can actually prior to that, it's when he was with Newark, New Jersey. So in 1911, right, very coming up through the ranks, and he got his own baseball card. Here's another one. Some of these would be affiliated with bread, right? You could find them in loaves of bread. You find them in packs of cigarettes. You might know the name Onus Wagner. His card is the most valuable from this set because he made them quit making it because he did not want kids buying cigarettes to get his card out of the pack. And that's one of the reasons. He was a very great baseball player too, but it's one of the reasons there's so few of his cards. This was in Cracker Jacks. And so you have a Forrest Cady baseball card there. And then a little pennant. It's probably no bigger than the size of my hand, fingertip to palm. So again, there's some memorabilia out there from our beloved Bishop Hillian, Forrest Cady. So, you got the next slide, please? Yeah, so again, after he quit playing in the major leagues, he didn't want to give up, and this was very common for many Major League Baseball players. Today, when a player retires, they've made millions and millions of dollars. They've got enough to live on. Back then, it was a salary. You basically made enough to live that year. They made a good living. but there were only so many Babe Ruths getting paid ridiculous amounts of money. And so many of the Major League Baseball players would go back down into the minor league systems because, let's face it, they would be a drawing card. If you could get a former World Series champion now to play minor league baseball, you could sell more tickets. And so Forrest Cady bounced around. You can see that he spent a lot of time in California, some in the Midwest, in Missouri and in Danville, Illinois, and in many cases he was a player manager. And so he would manage the team as well as play. He finished up playing, though, in 1924, and after that, he became an umpire. And so, yeah, funny, right? He got kicked out, ended his baseball career, and he becomes an umpire. And very similarly, and I wish he wouldn't have met his untimely death because he went through the ranks. He basically went back to where he started playing baseball. He umpired in Kewanee. He umpired in the Central Associations, the Central League. He umpired in Evansville. He eventually made his way out to California and umpired in the Pacific Coast League, which was becoming a very high-level baseball organization. And I wonder if the next step couldn't have been Major League Baseball for him because he had climbed the steps just like he did as a baseball player. But unfortunately, and Shauna, can you go to the next slide? He met his death on March 3rd, 1946, in a hotel fire. This is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and as you can imagine, too, many of the players had to work outside of the season. Matter of fact, when Cady was playing baseball, he would come back to Bishop Hill and work in Kewanee on occasion. When he was umpiring, he took a job as a hotel clerk, and there was an electrical fire from an electrical heater malfunctioned in his room, and his was the only room that burned, and Cady died of suffocation, and he had supposedly third-degree burns all over his body. There was no way that he was going to be saved. But this article said that he was 53. I was just having a conversation with my mom this morning. It's amazing how much newspapers got wrong back in the day. But we have everything at our fingertips, right, with the internet. He was actually 60 years of age when he passed away. So he spent basically from 17 years of age in amateur baseball till his death at the age of 60 pursuing baseball as a career, either as a player, player manager, or an umpire. And so, again, probably the support of Bishop Hill, going back to that 1888 article, the community buying baseball supplies for the young men here, supporting it in our community. It's not a surprise to me that he pursued this. It's a surprise to me that he was so successful at doing it. And then that is the end of my presentation today.